Zsa Zsa Gabor became one of the most photographed women of the 20th century without ever winning an Oscar, headlining a Broadway show, or releasing a single record. Think about that for a moment. She was famous, genuinely, globally, extravagantly famous for being herself. For the diamonds, for the marriages, for the accent that dripped like honey over every television couch she ever graced. By the time the 1960s arrived, Zsa Zsa was not merely a celebrity. She was a category, a walking, talking argument that personality alone could conquer the most competitive entertainment market on earth. Magazines printed her name. Talk show hosts competed for her bookings. She married 9 times, and the public devoured every single ceremony. But here is the part that the documentaries skip over. Zsa Zsa was not the only Gabor sister. There were 3 of them, born in Budapest, trained by the same fiercely ambitious mother, launched into the same post-war world with the same extraordinary looks, the same aristocratic Hungarian manners, the same hunger that Jolie Gabor had installed in all of her daughters like a factory setting. Eva Gabor stepped into the spotlight too. She built a real career. She earned her place. And then there was Magda, the eldest, the one who stood closest to the explosion, watched it happen, survived things her sisters never did, and then, quietly and on her own terms, built something the cameras almost never captured. This is her story, and it is nothing like what you expect. Quick pause before we get into the architecture of this empire. We are building something real here, a channel built on the stories that the official histories leave out. The children, the costs, the quiet devastation behind the famous names. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. We're on our way to 1,000 subscribers, and every single person who joins this community makes the next story possible. And tell me in the comments, which part of this hit you hardest? Judy's surgery? John's quiet life? The line about not giving a damn? I read every comment. I want to know. Chapter 1, The Incubation Chamber. Budapest in the 1920s was a city performing a very specific kind of theater. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed less than a decade earlier, and what remained in Hungary was a nation rebuilding its self-image from rubble. The upper middle class, the professionals, the merchants, the jewelers, clung to elegance the way drowning people cling to furniture. Appearances were not vanity. They were survival. They were the signal you sent to a destabilized world that said, "We are still here. We are still people of standing." Vilmos Gabor ran a jewelry business. Jolie, his wife, was the engine of the household, restless, theatrical, obsessed with beauty and social elevation in a way that felt less like ambition and more like oxygen. She needed it to breathe. Into this environment, 3 daughters arrived. Magda came first, born in 1915. Zsa Zsa followed in 1917. Eva arrived in 1919. The birth order matters more than it might seem. Magda was always the eldest in a household that worshipped newness. Every milestone she reached, her first dress fitting, her first introduction to society, her first understanding of what Jolie expected. Zsa Zsa arrived to repeat 2 years later, louder, brighter, with more instinctive theatrical voltage. Magda was the prototype. The city's social expectations pressed down on her first. She learned what was required. She adapted. She moved through the rituals of a Budapest girlhood, the languages, the manners, the studied elegance, with a compliance that looked identical to enthusiasm if you did not look too carefully. But she was always watching. This is the detail that the family mythology tends to erase. Magda Gabor was an observer by nature in a family that rewarded performance. While Jolie was refining Zsa Zsa's presentation and engineering introductions, Magda was the daughter already in the room, already absorbing information, already drawing conclusions about what this life actually cost. She saw the machinery before her sisters did. She understood, perhaps earlier than anyone gave her credit for, that the world Jolie was building for her daughters was not a gift without conditions. It was a contract. Fame, marriage, title, beauty, these were currencies, not freedoms. And Magda, from her quiet position at the front of the line, was the first to understand exactly what the exchange rate was. Chapter 2, The Explosion and the Witness. The war changed everything, as wars tend to do. But for the Gabor sisters, it changed everything in directions that moved them violently apart. Zsa Zsa left Hungary in 1939. She married a Turkish diplomat, born in Belgium, and began constructing the international identity that would eventually become her primary product. By the time she arrived in America, by the time she entered the orbit of Conrad Hilton and married one of the wealthiest hoteliers on the continent, The container of Budapest had been completely destroyed. She was outside it. She was outside everything. What does it feel like to watch your younger sister do that? Magda did not escape the war with the ease that mythology sometimes implies for the Gabor family. She remained closer to the horror of it. She endured a marriage to Jan Dubachovsky that brought none of the protection or elevation it was supposed to provide. There were losses, real, irreversible, the kind that leave marks that no amount of socialite glamour can fully cover. Magda survived experiences during the war years that Zsa orbit of Hollywood parties and Hilton hotel suites made structurally impossible to share or fully explain. She arrived in America after the war carrying a different weight than her sisters. Stand in that room for a moment. You have grown up in the same house, learned the same lessons, absorbed the same instruction manual about beauty and ambition and the correct way to enter a room. And then you watch your sister, 2 years younger, same origin, same mother, become a name that Americans are saying with a kind of delighted reverence usually reserved for royalty and mythology. Zsa was not just successful. She was a phenomenon. Television appearances multiplied. The Hilton divorce generated the kind of coverage that studios spent fortunes manufacturing. The name Gabor became synonymous not just with glamour, but with a specific, irresistible archetype. The woman who was above convention, who wore excess as a philosophy, who turned every marriage and every scandal into a performance of magnificent self-confidence. And Magda watched all of it. This is the part that retention-brain documentary storytelling almost always misses. It focuses on what the famous person gained. It does not ask what it costs to be the witness. Magda did not arrive in America broken, but she arrived with the kind of clarity that only proximity to catastrophe and proximity to spectacular success simultaneously can produce. She had seen both ends. She knew what both felt like, and she was not going to mistake the louder one for the better one. Chapter 3: The Parallel Path and the Refusal. She tried it. This is the part the narrative requires honesty about. Magda Gabor was not someone who simply stood aside from the beginning. She made moves. She understood the game. She had been trained for it as thoroughly as her sisters, and she possessed the fundamental qualifications. The looks, the accent, the social architecture, the Gabor name, which by the early 1950s was itself a form of currency in American entertainment circles. She appeared on American television. She made the rounds. She understood, intellectually and practically, what the machinery expected from a woman with her last name and her particular arrangement of features. But something happened in those rooms that was different from what happened to Zsa. Where Zsa experienced the spotlight as confirmation, as the world finally catching up to what she had always privately known about herself, Magda experienced it as information. Data. Evidence about whether this particular life was actually compatible with who she actually was. The answer came back clearly. There is a documented quality to Magda's social personality that her contemporaries consistently noted. She was warm, sharp, genuinely funny, but she possessed an almost alarming level of groundedness that the performance industrial complex finds deeply inconvenient. She was not interested in manufacturing a self. She was too busy being one. When opportunities presented themselves that required her to become a Gabor-shaped product rather than a Magda-shaped person, she declined. Not with drama. That would have been the Zsa approach. She declined plainly, practically, without theatrical apology. There are accounts of Magda redirecting attention away from herself in situations where another Gabor would have leaned directly into the camera. She was not performing humility. She was exercising preference. The distinction matters enormously, and most people miss it. Genuine refusal does not look like retreat. It does not look sad. It looks like someone who has fully evaluated the prize and determined, with clear-eyed competence, that the prize is not worth what they would have to pay for it. Magda Gabor understood something her sisters, particularly Zsa, took decades to begin approaching, that the public persona is not free. It must be fed, constantly, at accelerating cost. Every marriage becomes content. Every scandal becomes obligation. Every private grief becomes raw material for the next round of public consumption. She looked at the contract. She understood its terms better than almost anyone alive in that world, because she had watched someone she loved sign it in real time. And she set it down. Chapter 4: The Geographic Escape and Secret Empire. The decision that defined Magda Gabor's life did not announce itself with trumpets. It arrived quietly, as most genuinely consequential decisions do, in the form of a man named Tony Gallucci and a choice of geography that removed her, deliberately and completely, from the particular atmosphere in which Gabor women were expected to be performing at all times. She moved. She built. She chose. Palm Springs, California became her world in a way that Hollywood and New York, the twin capitals of the Gabor myth, never were. This was not accidental geography. Palm Springs in the post-war decades was a place where wealthy people went to actually live rather than to be seen living. The distinction is architectural. The distinction is psychological. It is the difference between a stage and a home. Magda married George Sanders in 1970, an actor, a man of genuine complexity and not uncomplicated history, someone who had himself an uneasy relationship with the machinery of fame. The marriage was brief, but what followed was not collapse. What followed was the construction of a real life. She became a serious presence in the Palm Springs social world, not as a celebrity satellite, but as an actual community figure. She developed genuine friendships rather than strategic alliances. She built financial stability through means that did not require her to be a product. She cultivated the kind of social capital that does not photograph well because it is made of actual trust and actual reciprocity rather than publicity strategy. Compare this, and you must compare this, because the contrast is the entire point, to what was happening simultaneously with Zsa Zsa. The marriages multiplied. The scandals escalated. Each one generated more coverage than the last, which meant each one required more spectacle, more excess, more performance to maintain the mythology's momentum. The 1989 arrest after the altercation with a Beverly Hills police officer was perhaps the moment when the machinery that Zsa Zsa had been feeding for 5 decades turned visibly against her. The public laughed. Then the public moved on. And Zsa Zsa, at 72, was required to keep performing for an audience that had fundamentally changed what it wanted from her. Magda in Palm Springs was not performing. She was living. This is not a retreat from greatness, because Magda had never claimed greatness as her destination. It was a life she had chosen on its own terms, stable, warm, anchored by genuine relationships, financially real, emotionally present. A life that did not require a publicist to make sense of it. That is rarer than any title any of the Gabor sisters ever married into. Chapter 5, the climax, the enduring shadow. By the time the 1990s arrived, Zsa Zsa Gabor was no longer a phenomenon. She was a monument, and monuments are, by definition, things that have stopped moving. The final decades were not kind in the way that fame, when it finally abandons you, is never kind. There were financial pressures. The household in Bel Air required maintenance that the working actress income of the 1950s could no longer reliably fund. Frederick von Anhalt, husband number 9, became both her primary caretaker and a source of continuing public theater that the world parsed with less and less affection. Zsa Zsa suffered a stroke in 2010, then a car accident, then a leg amputation, then years of relative immobility in a house that had once been the setting for legendary parties. The woman who had built an identity on movement, on entrance, on the electric charge of arriving, was confined. Magda died in 1997, a decade before Zsa Zsa's decline became most acute. But the shape of her life, the structure she had built through preference and refusal and geographic escape and genuine community, outlasted her in the way that quiet things often outlast loud ones. She had not been the famous one. She had been the free one. This is the philosophical thesis that the Gabor story keeps offering and that the public narrative consistently refuses to receive. That the sister who stepped back, who declined, who moved to the desert and built something real and human and bounded, that sister won. Not by the metrics the Gabor mythology was designed to celebrate, but by every metric that actually matters when you get old and the cameras stop and you are finally alone with what you actually built. Magda Gabor loved her sisters. The accounts of her tenderness toward them, particularly toward Zsa Zsa in moments of private vulnerability, reveal a woman who never confused the performance with the person beneath it. She always saw who was actually there. She always chose what was actually real. That is the life that lasted. 3 sisters. Same mother. Same city. Same training. Same name. One became a global icon and spent 50 years feeding a machine that ultimately consumed her. One built a real career through genuine discipline and work. And one, the eldest, the observer, the one standing slightly behind, looked at everything being offered, understood its cost with extraordinary clarity, and chose differently. The world did not give Magda Gabor a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. It gave her something quieter, something the cameras cannot capture and the tabloids cannot monetize. It gave her an actual life. If this story made you think differently about what success actually looks like, what it costs, what it lasts, what it means, then subscribe, because that is the exact conversation we are building here, one forgotten figure at a time. The shadow is always more interesting than the spotlight. We will see you in the next one.